Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 10th of June 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
I regret to say we're going to start with the Tory leadership. And the question is, Patrick, did the 3 or 4 people that came out and admitted to having taken, in some cases, Class A drugs, did they think that this was going to endear them to the younger voter, or what was the reason for that?
It worked for some people, Mike. Some people have got a bounce in the polls as a result, but let's have a look.
Here's Conservative Home. They've decided to go with Boris Johnson. Now, it's quite interesting because Boris, who's a front runner, perhaps the front runner, and Rory Stewart, who seems to be coming up from behind, as is his wont, they're getting into the Twitter game. Let's look at compare their approaches. Here's what Boris has been pushing out, a whole bunch of I'm backing Boris graphics with some pretty big names on there. So he's clearly keen to present the idea that the likes of Owen Paterson and Priti Patel and Alan Cairns and James Not So Cleverly and so on are all backing Boris. It goes on and on. There's hundreds of them out there, it seems.
Oh, Michael Fallon.
Michael Fallon, of course. And I believe that our erstwhile Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, is also backing Boris, I believe. So, what's Boris been saying in the media? Well, he had a nice big article in the Telegraph today. Economic innovation will turn the UK into a clean green powerhouse, and he's extremely excited about the fact that we're stopping growing food in our fields and we're putting solar panels in our fields instead. This is a step forward, isn't it?
And the fact that Britain gets so much sunlight every year, Mike.
Well, he even says this in the article. It's quite amazing.
It makes it all even more worthwhile.
Absolutely. Well, let's have a look at Rory and what he's been up to. Well, he's decided to go with the little 2 or 3 minute video clips on Twitter. So he's going out and the man of the people, shaking hands with people and so on. You can see the style of it. People will be glad to know that I haven't included any of the actual audio because you don't want to listen to what he's saying. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have gone entirely well when it comes to.
What is this? He's hanging out in the hood.
Yes,
he's hanging out in the hood. So Tories can be cool and have street cred. This is great.
That's right. So
it's a great bit of PR.
So he had this nice little conversation, but unfortunately these 3 guys, one of them said, I don't F with politics, man. And they all walked off. So they weren't terribly impressed with him. It kind of backfired on him.
Yeah.
But this is the Rory Stewart approach. And what about Jeremy Hunt? Here he is on Twitter, and he said he's very concerned by the arrest of Russian investigative journalist Ivan Gulinov of Meduza Project. Journalists must be free to hold power to account without fear of retribution. And he clearly hasn't got to grips with the idea of Twitter yet, because he got absolutely slated in the comments section below, because of course everybody was throwing the name Julian Assange at him on one hand, and as you pointed out in your comment to him, of course, Ivan Gulinov, also connected to drugs.
Well, he was arrested for drug dealing, basically. It wasn't. I don't believe, Mike, it was because of his journalistic work that he was actually arrested. That's the whole point of this story. It looks like possession of narcotics, Mike, with intent to deal. So that it would be a crime in any country, including Britain. So I'm not exactly sure. We don't know the full story yet because obviously has to go through the legal process. But where's Jeremy Hunt coming from on this? And the Meduza Project is known as a kind of Western fifth column.
I think that's where he's coming from there.
Yeah, it's a Western fifth column. I'm not sure if they have funding from the Open Society and Soros organizations and National Endowment for Democracy. We didn't have time to check through the funding of the Meduza Project, but certainly it's one of those quintessential Pussy Riot, left-wing, MoveOn.org style implants in the Eastern Bloc, which is designed to sort of, help break down politics on the other side of the old Iron Curtain.
What do we take out of this? The leadership election is a circus, just as Brexit has been a circus. Things are not improving in UK politics. The only sort of light at the end of the tunnel, or extra comedic value perhaps, is that Emmanuel Macron has criticised Boris Johnson because Johnson claimed that he was going to refuse to pay the £39 billion divorce bill. But of course, that divorce bill relies on there being a deal. And since Boris is saying there'll be no deal if he becomes leader, then this is not a sovereign debt default because there's no debt there if there isn't a deal. But anyway, we'll move on. What's going on with if we think that Jeremy Hunt is talking about free speech in the press? What is actually going on with respect to free speech in the press, Patrick?
Well, as people would have seen if they follow social media, one of the big stories over the last couple of weeks, well, over the last couple of months and years actually, but it hit another sort of crescendo this past week, which is the sort of deplatforming, and specifically by Silicon Valley organizations like Facebook, like Twitter, like Google, stroke YouTube, deplatforming of conservative voices or right-wing voices. And so this is an interesting piece here penned by Niall Ferguson. Niall Ferguson is a fairly preeminent historian of contemporary times. He's also a member of the Bilderberg Group, coincidentally, which makes this all the more interesting that this piece made its way into the Times, which is the deep state's internal newsletter for the elite, because everything hides behind a paywall. And what Niall Ferguson is saying, that free speech is in free fall. He's basically sounding the alarm, Mike, that there's a problem here. And mind you, this is coming from somebody from the establishment. So he's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, which is in the Silicon Valley. So he's speaking from within the sort of the heart of the digital monopoly beast empire. But let's look at what he's talking about specifically, Mike. We're going to move on and look at the contents of this, because this is a fascinating argument he's actually putting forward here. And he's really pointing out that recent reports, Facebook has been more proactive in their censorship. Before, Mike, they were sort of preoccupied with removing content from pedophiles or terrorists, and that was the kind of pretext on which censorship took place with the big tech companies. But now he says they're engaged in political censorship. So the amount of content being removed from proactive censorship is much higher now. And there was actually a presentation last March, it was internal, Google presentation called The Good Censor. And he says what this was meant in practice is that tens of thousands of content moderators, such as young Adam, who this person he profiles in this piece in the Times, are deciding what you can and cannot see online. And these are the MSN enforcers. The mainstream media is playing a really interesting role in enforcing this regime. They're putting pressure on Silicon Valley companies like Facebook, most notably recently with Vox, which he talks about in this article that got a crowd, Louder with Crowder, a raucous conservative show on YouTube. He got that demonetized because of personal comments with a journalist at Vox. But Oliver Darcy from CNN is someone we've talked about before, who's really involved in sort of pushing the deplatforming of Alex Jones, for instance. So you can see mainstream media is playing a really proactive role, not just in the censorship, Mike, but in sort of using their mainstream media platforms to lobby and to put pressure on Silicon Valley companies.
And what do you think is driving that? Is that purely commercial? They're getting rid of the competition?
Well, they say that this is because of advertisers having concerns about certain contents and then policing hate speech. But yes, I think part of it is about getting rid of the competition. Mainstream sees a lot of alternative media outlets and TV programs on YouTube as potential competition for eyeballs. So they're eliminating. But more than that, Mike, I think a lot of it is political. It's a lot of it's ideological as well. It's an economic element to it, you're right, but it's also political, because this is the run-up to the 2020 elections in the United States, and it seems like they're trying to basically erase anything center of right that could be a threat to the Democratic Party. They don't want to see a repeat of what happened in 2016, and they're pulling out all the stops, and they don't really care about ethics or free speech or anything like this. So this is kind of a very dangerous sort of trend. Now, Ferguson continues here, and he says the big tech companies, this is the paradox, they can act as legislature, executive, the judiciary, and the press, for which they have double protection. What does he mean by double protection? Well, he's talking about, he's got the First Amendment is generally held to not apply to private companies like Facebook, like YouTube, like Google, okay? So, but Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act states interactive computer services are not publishers. So unlike newspapers, they can't be held responsible for the bad stuff that appears on their platform, but they can also, they cannot be held liable on the account of any action voluntarily taken in good faith to restrict the access, etc. That's the censorship side. So they have the best of both worlds in this sense, Mike.
So this is a very interesting point. I didn't know that there was legislation in place in the United States on this issue. So Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act says that platforms are not publishers. But if we look at the whole ideology behind this censorship policy, which is originated in the UK and spread out from there, it is absolutely promoting the notion that the platforms are publishers and therefore they have responsibility for the content which appears on their platforms. But in the case of the United States, at least, there would have to be legislation, a change in legislation in order to make that true.
Well, he addresses this in the next point, Mike, and it's not necessarily, it could be a change in legislation, but it could also be if this is ruled and how this is ruled on in sort of a higher courts. But if we go on to the next slide, well, he's talking about Section 230 here, and basically he's saying this was enacted when the internet was in its infancy, and this is the important part. So this is sort of outdated legislation, according to Niall Ferguson, and it's kind of a catch-22. How is it a catch-22? In that big tech firms are not publishers when harm arises from the content on their platforms, but they are publishers when they engage in censorship or deplatforming. So either way, they have minimal legal liability. So the big tech companies have exploited in a loophole in the interpretation of the law here. So, and he goes on to say Section 230 explicitly assumed online platforms would offer a forum for true diversity of discourse. This was the early days of the internet, Mike, and that's where the beef is. That's not happening. So because that second part there about having an open forum for a plurality of ideas and political discourse, because that's not what we're seeing. This is where the problem is.
But is that right, or is the problem the fact that there has been too much diversity of political discourse, and now they're wanting to shut? In fact, when this was envisaged, they never imagined that we would have the diversity of political discourse that we do today, and now they're wanting to shut that down.
Well, precisely, and he says here, and the phrase "or otherwise objectionable" was never intended to cover political positions.
Right.
But that's exactly what it's being used for now, Mike. So this is what this argument is trying to highlight here. So the bottom line here, they are entitled to Section 230's protection, but only if they uphold the diversity of discourse envisioned by Congress when that legislation was enacted in 1996. So there you have a pretty cogent argument there by Niall Ferguson. And just to round this off here, this is an important comment. So he says, it is true to say that the platforms are, in the words of recently retired Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, the modern public square. And we've talked about this before a lot on this program and the Sunday Wire. Yet, they are emphatically not acting in that spirit, unless it was Tiananmen Square Kennedy had in mind.
Right,
Now, bear in mind, we talked about the misreporting of Tiananmen Square 30 years ago. Let's put that off to the side.
Yeah.
Okay, but the point Niall Ferguson is making there, to me, is very clear. Mm-hmm. The public square in the West, in the democratic West, the free world, or is this Tiananmen Square in China? Mm. And this brings up a lot of interesting visions in one's mind, Mike. And one of those visions that this brings up is this. Facebook is hiring tens of thousands of content moderators. YouTube hiring tens of thousands of content moderators. What is this? This is from the South China Morning Post. These are one of the many boiler rooms, full office buildings, full of people who are content moderators for the Chinese government. Is this the system that we want in the West?
It's the system we're getting.
It's the system we're getting, but we're getting it as a corporate system.
Yes, because it's not central government which is running these boiler rooms. Well, that's okay then.
That's fine. Yeah, we're fine. It's private companies doing it, and they're doing it to protect users and to protect people from online harms and things like this. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But this kind of follows on to the other part of the story, Mike, in that YouTube is to ban hateful videos with supremacist content. So this kind of dovetails on what we just said, but here's the main point. They said, finally, we will remove content denying the well-documented violent events like the Holocaust or shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School and so forth that took place. So the question is, these are the key questions. How do you define a well-documented event going forward? What about debunked chemical attacks like Duma or Skripal, Mike? Will YouTube consider it hateful to question any aspect of an official narrative? And that's a question that we're going to explore in the Extra Time segment after the show today for members and subscribers. But that's the fundamental question, Mike. If this well-documented event or accepted science or accepted history, who decides if it's accepted history or accepted science or a well-documented event that you can't challenge? Who makes that decision?
That's a very good question. In this country, it's going to be a regulator for the internet. And if you want to just find out how this has happened, I said earlier on there that this policy originated with the UK government. It is spread out from the UK government far and wide. If you have a look at ukcolumn.org censored, the URL's on screen there, ukcolumn.org/censored, you can find a timeline which starts with David Cameron's speech to the United Nations General Assembly in 2014 and brings us up to date with the online harms white paper, which we covered on this program a couple of months ago. Now, the online harms white paper is absolutely focused. It talks about things like sexual exploitation, child sexual abuse, and so on. But its main focus is disinformation, fake news, any counter-narrative to the central government counter-narrative. And what they did was to launch a 12-week consultation on this online harms white paper. Have a look at ukcolumn.org/censored. At the end of the timeline is the link to the consultation, and I absolutely urge everyone to get involved in that. It is a public consultation, and it is extremely important because what's going to come out of this white paper is legislation, a regulator, and big fines for the platforms that don't want to censor in the right way. And this is really important. We've got to understand that although there seems to be, as Patrick has highlighted here, some cooperation from the platforms and from the mainstream media, but this is a government-driven censorship policy, and we've got to recognize that and recognize the dangers involved.
Yeah, because if it's kept within the corporate realm, Mike, then there's the issue that you could move to another platform, for instance, or self-publish. But if it becomes a government-mandated regime, then it becomes even more critical.
Well, it does. And one of the things that they've specifically said in the white paper was that they expected the large platforms to help, in inverted commas, the smaller platforms meet the regulations. This is all-encompassing.
So it's either people have to start stepping up to let the government know that they do value their own freedom of expression and free speech and free press, or the corporations are going to have to push back on these government regulators and regulations. It has to be either one or both, because right now we don't see any resistance or pushback from this, and we're entering a very dangerous phase right now.
Absolutely. Now, a bit of light relief, because last week, Patrick, you gave a report on Kim's big purge. Let's just remind ourselves what you said.
Well, Kim's big purge, I'm sure that people have noticed that in the last couple of days in the news, this talk of this massive purge. Kim was so angry about the failing of the U.S. North Korea summit that he ordered the purge of some of his top envoys because they failed. And so we're told that when people fail in the Kim regime, in the DPRK, that they strap them to missiles, fire them off, or they lower them into a pit full of dogs that haven't been fed in 2 years, or possibly a trapdoor into a pool of sharks. You've probably seen that on some of Sean Connery James Bond movies. Well, that's what they have in North Korea, and every single office has a trapdoor, and there's sharks always on call, crocodiles, all sorts of things, according to what most people think in the West.
So there we go, Patrick. Crocodiles, James Bond,
Sharks.
sharks.
Yeah.
Yes. So imagine my surprise, Patrick, when the Daily Star published this yesterday. Kim Jong-un executes general by throwing him in piranha-filled fish tank. And as we pointed out last week, of course, on last week's program, this kind of rubbish doesn't end with one because it was picked up by others. So here's the Daily Mail. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un executes a general accused of plotting a coup by throwing him in a piranha-filled fish tank. They say North Korean leader Kim Jong-un reportedly executed a general accused of plotting a coup by throwing him in a piranha-filled fish tank. The unnamed general, unnamed, was because obviously if he was named, we might find that he's still alive. So
Yeah,
he's unnamed
right.
this time. The unnamed general was said to be the latest victim of the dictatorial leader who has executed numerous aides, including his envoy to the US in May. So they even repeat that lie. The general was allegedly killed inside a giant piranha tank built inside Kim's Ryongsong residence in Pyongyang after being accused of plotting a coup, the Daily Star reported. The Daily Star claimed the North Korean leader may have been inspired by the 1965 James Bond movie You Only Live Twice to pursue the gruesome execution method. In the film, villain Blofeld has a pool filled with piranhas which he used to execute assistant Helga Brandt. A UK intelligence source told the Daily Star the use of piranhas is classic Kim. He is all about using fear and terror as a political tool. Whether or not the use of piranhas is an efficient way of killing someone won't bother him. He wants everyone to know, including his most trusted aides, that they are at risk of suffering a very unpleasant death if he suspects they're treasonous. Patrick, how much lower can the mainstream media go?
Well, the big question is, Mike, is the Daily Star watching the UK column get ideas for their headline stories? That's the actual question I have, Mike. But it's true that it is classic Kim, Mike, as they say in the Daily Mail and Daily Star there. And it's not that Kim wants everyone to know how ruthless he is. It seems like maybe he only wants the tabloids to know in the West, because they seem to be the only one who have a hotline to any of this breaking news, because I have no idea what their source is reading their article. So, but yeah, if they are watching the UK column, thank you very much for your viewership.
Yes. Okay, let's get a bit more serious again now. So the gross domestic product in the UK, this is really great stuff. It's increased by 0.3% in the 3 months to April 2019. So we're doing spectacularly well economically at the moment. Well, it doesn't end there, because the even better news is that manufacturing is now suffering a slump, lowest level in 6 years. This is BDO. A report by BDO who are saying that vacancies are falling, wage growth is collapsing, and basically manufacturing not doing very well at all. So this...
And neither of the think tanks, Mike. That looks like the Institute for Statecraft.
Well, it is, of course. It is the Institute for Statecraft. But anyway, they said this month's data is mixed, with sentiment in the services sector making a rebound after the granting of the UK's Brexit extension, because of course all these economic woes are due to Brexit. However, the manufacturing industry is set to be particularly badly affected over the next few months as it becomes clear that Brexit contingency planning artificially inflated growth in the start of 2019. So we're all doom and gloom and negative on our side, but on the Russian-Chinese side, they're not doing so badly. They held the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum over the weekend. This was the largest yet, 19,000 participants from 145 countries, 1,300 at the level of top leaders, and 7 heads of state. The organizers said this is the largest delegation this year was the Chinese with 1,072 participants. The second was the US delegation with 520 people. They said this year a record number of agreements were concluded, 650 agreements totaling 3.1 trillion rubles, which is around $48 billion. It's a significant event. Those are the ones that are not commercially secret, so there were other deals done as well. What did Mr. Putin have to say in his opening keynote? He said the first crisis facing the world today is the degeneration of the universalist globalization model, and it's turning into a parody, a caricature of itself. He said the second scenario is a fragmentation of global economic space by a policy of completely unlimited economic egoism and a forced breakdown. It's forced in the sense that he was really focusing on the issue of the economic warfare that's going on at the moment, the sanctions, the fact that the countries that are cooperating with each other are doing very well, but of course they're living in a world of globalization where the established order is attempting to stop the new order, the new
multipolar order,
right,
I guess,
from building, and he absolutely used that language and made that point. He said what undermines trust between the world economic players. I think the main reason is that the model of globalization offered in the late 20th century is increasingly at odds with the rapidly emerging new economic reality. In the past 3 decades, the share of advanced countries in global GDP and purchasing power parity decreased, whereas the weight of the countries with developing markets is growing. Such rapid development of new economies that, apart from their interests, have their own development platforms and views on globalization and regional integration processes does not correlate well with the ideas that seemed immutable relatively recently. And he's talking about the Western rules-based international order when he's talking about that. And he's saying here, we've got to return to the center of discussion notions like sovereignty, the unconditional right of every country to its own development road, and that was a very key part of this meeting and this conference. The fact that the West is attempting to impose rules on everybody else. They're wanting to break down national borders and get rid of national identities and get rid of the idea that any country has the right to decide what path it's going to take. Putin and Xi seem to be going in exactly the other direction.
Well, look at the Paris Climate Accords, Mike, and sort of the international climate carbon reduction regimes are kind of running in the sort of same direction of what Vladimir Putin is describing there, which is the sort of countries should be able to chart their own development course.
Right.
And what the climate accords are dictating, essentially, is that the West, the developed world, has been allowed to develop, and that's great, but Africa and some of these lesser developed countries, they can't be allowed to develop in the way the West has.
Right.
They can't, they just can't, because the planet won't be able to take it anymore because of climate change, and therefore they must remain underdeveloped, but that's okay, because we have lots of NGOs and various programs that we can help give them aid.
Yes.
And therefore, everything's okay. So this is why the climate agreements continue to break down and continue to require more arm twisting behind the scenes by sort of elites in Africa, Europhile elites in Africa or pro-American elites, and they're still doing these deals, Mike, but they actually don't make a lot of sense for these countries.
Right.
Because if you look at Europe, the most green countries in Europe have been allowed to develop the full arc of development. They've used coal and all of these things to get to where they are, to the point where their standard of living is high enough, their social services are so well developed that they can now invest in loss-leading green technologies for cleaner air and cleaner everything. Okay, this is an extra benefit that comes with development, Mike. And this is the paradox of that whole conversation. So I think Putin's actually touched on that rhetorically anyway in that speech.
Speaking of trying to impose rules on countries, this was an article. I think the Express was the only newspaper that actually covered this that I could see. The headline is Italy reacts, Rome to activate alternative currency in move to spark Eurozone divorce. And they say the key members of Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini's Lega Party have floated the possibility of a new domestic currency to help pay its debts. The plans have only been emphasised after the European Commission paved the way for an initial fine of €3 billion on Wednesday. The EU's Brussels-based executive warned that punishments were warranted because Italy had met the threshold for disciplinary action. Alberto Bagnai, president of the Finance Committee of the Senate, has also shown support for the proposal. Mr. Borghi has said that the plan for so-called mini-bot treasury notes are written into the Lega Five-Star Movement's coalition contract. He said it's the way to mobilise credit that is badly needed and put money into circulation. Now, this is really fascinating because what they're talking about is treasury notes. And of course, this is what the Bradbury pound was in the lead up to the First World War and during the First World War. Treasury notes signed by the Treasury Secretary, Mr. Bradbury, and subsequent Treasury Secretaries. So this is quite interesting, but what's equally interesting is the response from the European Central Bank. And this bit the Express didn't cover because here is Mario Draghi, and his response was either Treasury bonds are money and this is illegal, or they're debt. And of course, Italy is not intending to issue these as debt because Italy wants to use this money, and it is money, to regenerate its economy in much in the same way that China is at the moment. But Draghi absolutely making it clear that any attempt to do that would be viewed as being illegal. So what he's saying is, because the question that I've been asking for many, many years, Patrick, is why does a sovereign nation need to borrow money from outside the country? Why can it not, from private banks who are creating money out of nothing, why can it not, as a sovereign act, issue its own currency? And of course, that's what Italy's talking about here, issuing its own money through the instrument of treasury bonds. And Draghi saying that that's illegal. So in other words, that is a choice. It's a choice not to do it that way. And why? Because, of course, bankers can only make money if there's interest charged on it.
Yes, and this is the problem with social credit or treasury issuance of credit, of hard money. It's because it does cut the bankers out
Absolutely.
of that sort of transaction.
Absolutely. Well, we have to mention the F-35 again. Here it is. Well, if you remember a few months ago, an F-35 crashed off the coast of Japan, killing its pilot. This was the first fatal accident as far as I remember. Well, the results are in. The Japanese government is now saying that the pilot experienced vertigo. This is Takeshi Iwaya, who said, "We believe it's highly likely the pilot was suffering from vertigo or spatial disorientation and wasn't aware of his condition." Well, this is sheer speculation because the truth is that the black boxes apparently have not generated any useful data, so they can't, or at least they're claiming that they don't know what the cause of this crash actually was. So they're claiming it's vertigo. The problem here, Patrick, is that vertigo has many, at least describing it as vertigo or spatial disorientation, but the symptoms of vertigo are very similar to the symptoms of hypoxia. This is whenever you don't get enough oxygen, and actually it makes you feel euphoric, it makes you feel very good, it makes you not really aware of what's going on around you. You certainly would experience spatial disorientation. I find it extremely difficult to accept that a military pilot who is experienced enough to be put on this aircraft in the first place, that already had 60 hours on the aircraft, would be suffering from any kind of vertigo. This, in my opinion, was hypoxia, and the problem for the F-35 is that it has a history of pilots from suffering from hypoxia. We've been reporting this for a very long time. This is an Ars Technica report from 2017 on this issue. It was claimed that the issue was resolved. The hypoxia issue grounded these aircraft for a period of time. I think it's highly likely that if what this pilot experienced was disorientation, hypoxia was the reason.
Why doesn't Japan sue the United States then?
Because
or the
Japan,
manufacturer? Because
Japan is in the. This is the problem with these types of multinational procurement processes, because there's maintenance contracts tied up into it. There's all kinds of stuff tied up into it. Everybody's in the game.
Interesting. So interesting.
So where does that take us?
Well, this is if you haven't already heard, the deal of the century is set to be unveiled probably by the end of June. We're told there's big parties scheduled in Bahrain. This is Saudi Arabia's offshore pleasure palace island, just off of the mainland of Saudi Arabia, and this is where Jared Kushner is going to be rolling out. This is the president-in-law in Washington. He's going to be rolling out the deal of the century. This is the peace deal, supposedly to solve all the problems of the Israelis and the Palestinians. And we have this U.S. envoy coming out just this weekend saying Israel now has the right to annex Palestinian land in the West Bank. And basically what that means, Mike, is that they want to roll back the internationally recognized Palestinian territories in the West Bank currently being occupied by Israel, by Israeli settlers, by the IDF. They're wanting to sort of ignore that, go around that, and just annex it, basically. And the most disturbing part about this in the run-up to the deal of the century is that there's very little, if any, pushback that's visible from the EU, and certainly not from the Democratic Party in the United States. I mean, this is an open goal if you wanted to prosecute a case in the election against the president. If you wanted to weaken the Trump administration, just the steamrolling of international law and multiple UN resolutions that's taking place right now. But the problem is there's a bipartisan consensus with regards to Israel in America.
And is this because both parties are receiving support from Israel?
Because both parties are bought and paid for, and politicians are quite frankly afraid to break ranks on this issue, quite frankly. And not only that, it's career suicide on many levels for politics. A lot of politicians might want to step into the media after they leave politics. Now they're going straight into the networks. Now that's going to be a problem as well, because let's face it, and it's no secret, this has been fleshed out in academic peer-reviewed papers. The Israeli lobby is very powerful in the United States, and they have a lot of influence, and that influence stretches not just into politics, but into big corporate media as well, and think tanks. So this is a problem. This is what you get. This is what you get as a result. Bad policy.
And a dodgy deal.
It's a dodgy deal. The deal of the century is a dodgy deal. I've detailed this in an earlier op-ed piece a couple weeks ago at 21st Century Wire. I've said this is what's going to happen with the deal, and I'm going to just say again that some people we spoke to who are experienced Middle East journalists have said that this deal of the century might very well be used as a trigger to start a major war in Gaza,
right,
which would result in refugees from that area if it was really, really bad. And then you do have the forced displacement of large amounts of Palestinians. Maybe Israelis too, Mike. I don't know how bad it's going to get. But judging by the past battles in Gaza, the Palestinians will bear 99% of the brunt of any conflict. So, because they're not equipped to fight back, basically. So, yeah, we'll see how this plays out this month.
Okay, well, we began with a leadership election. We should end with a leadership election of sorts, because this is who is going to lead the Democratic Party into the 2020 election.
Well, this is an interesting piece here by The Guardian, and kind of surprising as well, being a liberal progressive rag, The Guardian. So she's saying Joe Biden is the Hillary Clinton of 2020. And it won't end well this time either. So our headline for this is 2020 Democrat Groundhog Day. You know, Groundhog Day means, Mike, it means that you wake up and everything's the same, like in the film with Bill Murray. And this is exactly what the Democrats are making. The identical mistake is they have a predetermined nominee before the primaries even start. The whole establishment's throwing their weight, the media behind one single candidate. That's the anointed one. This time it's Joe Biden who's like 77 years old. He'll be 78, who knows, 79 by the time he's sworn in. I'm not sure. That's like only, it's 10 dog years from now. But it's ridiculous. So what they're going to end up doing is a replay of the 2016 elections. Bernie Sanders will be the insurgent candidate. They will then railroad him. Bernie's voters will rebel. They won't vote for Biden in the general, and you'll get Trump in 2020. So this is what this Guardian journalist is trying to sort of get across here. So this is an interesting piece, and I'm happy to see this in the Guardian, Mike, because it means that a lot of people are finally waking up to the reality that we've been talking about now for months. So.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for joining us. We will be back at the same time on Wednesday, 1 p.m. We hope to see you then. Bye-bye.